Well, thank you. And it's a little overwhelming because a lot of people I know from the past showed up, and that's always not a little scary, a lot scary. And so those of you that know me from the past, you probably know I've never had problems with difficult conversations. I just haven't done them very well. And I've learned something the last few years that I want to share with you today. But I do want to recognize that my wife Barbara is here, and point to her right here. Thank you. And the reason I mention that is some of you who've heard me speak before know that I've said we've been married 45 years now, but at the 15-year mark in our marriage, we went through a crisis. And it was at that time that our marriage could have ended. That was a possibility. And what happened was that Barb turned to God and developed a relationship. And a year later, I did the same. And from that point forward, we have worked on our relationship as a couple, with our family, and we continue to work on it. We've learned principles and techniques that have helped us. And one of the things that's helped us in the last couple years is this difficult conversation, because boy, during that 15th year was a humdinger. We had a lot of difficult conversations that did not go very well. So I don't know how you do in those kind of conversations. I know I've never avoided them in the workplace, and I really didn't like them in my personal life. So there's a new way to do it. And we do have, I want to mention, we do have 3 adult children. We have 6 grandchildren from 5 to 23. They live up in the Puyallup, Tacoma area. Now what I'd like to do today, actually the first time I spoke here I had a 12-page handout, and then the second time I had a 7-page, and look how good I'm doing. So does anyone not have a handout? Okay, okay, there should be some back there. And the way I'd like to approach this, I will start with you having a discussion in your the area there, what makes for a difficult conversation. Then I want to share some principles that Barbara and I have used, have you consider those. Then I'm going to show you typical scenarios, because when I go into the workplace, I usually ask, what are the challenging issues in the workplace? And it's always about communication. I put some of those there, including some personal challenges there. And then I'm going to share something that we went through, Barbara and I went through last year about this time, and I have the permission of the gentleman I went through it with. I had to call him the other day to get permission, and I won't use his name. And then I want to talk about some principles to pull out of what I went through, because I absolutely had to use that. So with that, I'm going to ask you to, in your small groups there, and by the way, participate to the level that you're comfortable. You don't have to say anything or do anything, but feel free to have a discussion. And the question is, what makes a conversation difficult? And I'll just give you a minute or two to talk about that. I'm going to give you about another 20 seconds to wrap up the last thought there. if I could get everyone's attention again. And by the way, I'm hard of hearing, so I have hearing aids, and I need to tell Richard, if you hear a buzz, it may not be a cell phone, it may be a battery going out. So, and I'm not going to ask you for the feedback. Let me tell you some of the typical responses I get. One is that there's emotions involved. Some people are wired for harmony, so any kind of conflict really bothers them, very difficult. You don't know what the reaction will be, or you do know what the reaction will be. And then I think the other thing is we've really, at least I've never really been taught, how do you have a difficult conversation? You know, I've gone to training for how to communicate better, and it's, you know, listen and use iMessages, but those still don't work in the heat of battle. They haven't worked in the heat of battle. What I'd like you to do now is, you know, I have a couple of proverbs on there, and I point this out. I'm 100% Italian, and Barbara is 50% Swedish. And those are, we went to Sweden and Italy a few years ago, and those are very different countries. I loved Italy, and she loved Sweden. And we love each other. So anyway, but I just thought I'd show you the contrast. It says, if you scatter thorns, don't go barefoot. Now that's an Italian proverb, and that makes a lot of sense to me. The other one is, the afternoon knows what the morning never suspected. That's Swedish, so I don't know what that means. So that'll just give you an idea of what we've gone through. But now I'd like you, there are six proverbs there. They're not Italian or Swedish, but nevertheless they're proverbs. Take a look through those, and maybe some of those will resonate with you, that you may be doing those things and they've been helpful, or you haven't, and if you did, they would be. So I'll give you a few seconds to read through those. Okay, I heard a few people make some sounds like, gee, that's a good one. So these are ones, when I mentioned Barbara and I kind of learned some principles that have helped us. These are some of those principles. Now below that, and then the question to ask yourself is, if you were to really zero in on one of these and try to practice that day in and day out, what would be the consequence? And I believe you'd have a better outcome than maybe you do now. Then you'll see down below on that first page some typical scenarios. And again, I'd like you just to browse through those to see if those are things that you've been involved in the past, or maybe those are issues you're dealing with today. And then from that, I'll take you through my personal story. Okay, looks like most people got through that. I want to mention number 10 here, talking to a coworker about a personal hygiene issue. Years ago, as a young lieutenant in the Air Force up in Alaska, we had someone in our office that had a, odor. And I was a young lieutenant. I didn't know how to do this, and I was in charge, so I had to have that conversation. And I called her in. I feel terrible to say this, but I said, you know what? You really smell. Not a good way to start a conversation. So let me tell you what I learned. I wasn't going to do this, but it makes a lot of sense. I actually saw a video that did this, and somebody called someone, actually met him in a break room and said, I have something to share with you of a personal nature. And he said, sometimes the odor of your body is too noticeable. Now, isn't that a lot better than you smell? Sometimes, because we all have odors, but sometimes the odor of your body is too noticeable. And then, and so I just wanted you to know that, and unless it's a medical issue, you may want to look into that. So I think I wish I'd learned that, 30 years ago. Okay, now, if you will flip the page here, I'm taking this information from a couple of books. The primary one is Crucial Conversations, and there's a great web page listed underneath it. You can go out to that web page, you can click on their free newsletter, and once a week, they send out, people write in and say, here's the challenge I have. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's professional. And they talk through the model. It's very helpful. And the definition of a crucial conversation: stakes are high, opinions differ, and emotions run strong. So would that suit everybody's definition of a crucial conversation? And then I'm just going to point out to the right, you'll see that it says fact, story, feel, and act. The idea is we act a certain way because of the way we feel. We feel a certain way because of the story we tell ourselves, and the story we tell ourselves is based on our interpretation of facts. So let me tell you my story that I have permission to share. A year ago, September, Barbara and I had a remodel, and we thank the Latins who are here today. They let us move into their apartment up on their beautiful home up on the Skyline. So for 3.5 months we lived up there. And we had spent a year getting a contractor, and the gentleman we hired, we really liked him. He was a pleasant fellow, lots of experience. We saw his work and did a nice job of budgeting. And then we go into the process, and we were 1 month into it, and it was very difficult for Barb to even go down to the house. I went down there because my computer was there and I was doing all my work there. And what happened was that first of all, when we hired him, we said, there are some subcontractors we'd like to use. Is that okay with you? And he was fine with it. Well, it turned out he probably wasn't fine with it. We found him to be rude to them. And an example would be, one of them, when Barb was talking to him, he said to her, you need to tell her to get her act together. And, you know, I mean, those are harsh words. And then one day when I was talking to him, he said, how many lights you want in these couple of rooms? And I said, 19. And he turned to me and he said, what are you going to have, a used car lot? Now, I don't know how that came across to you, but I felt it was rude, and there were other instances like that. So we're a month into it. We know we have at least probably 2.5, 3 months to go. And I finally thought, I talked to some people and they said, you got to be careful, because if you confront him, he's liable to walk off the project. And I thought, I'm not going to, you know, we're not going to go through this. And so I got out the book and I went through this again. And here's something to think about. So the place to start when you're going to have a difficult conversation, based on this little fact, story, feel, act, my thought was, why would he act that way? And so there must have been something that he was feeling to cause him to do that. And what was the story he was telling himself, and what were the facts? And so as I thought through that, I thought, well, two things. Even though he said he was okay with a subcontractor, maybe he wasn't. And then the other one was, he was so cost conscious. The person that recommended him said he would, when he showed his bill, he would show how much for a box of nails. And it's like, and I love that. I mean, I'm a numbers guy. So I really like that. And I thought, you know, when we have gone to him, like the 19 lights, I'm sure he looked at I'm guessing he looked at the budget and said, you know, that's going to cost way more than we budgeted. So that's the first thing I did. And that's the first thing you need to do, is when you're going into a conversation, is what's the story you're telling yourself? And oftentimes it's a negative one. It may be true, but we need to check it out. But by saying, what are some possibilities? And maybe some of you think maybe you're a contractor. Why might you have done that? Not being rude, but certainly brought up those comments. The second thing is then, I need to know what I want out of the conversation. I shared this book with a friend a couple years ago, and then he was finally able to read it. And he told me the thing that struck him is, when he goes into tough conversations, he doesn't usually know what he wants. He comes out figuring he's won, and yet he doesn't feel good about it. And so when he heard, or when he read, what do you want out of the conversation? He was having that conversation in a couple weeks with someone that ran a department. And the next week we talked about it. He said he can't believe the difference in their relationship, going in knowing what he wanted. So you know, the things on the left, it says, what is the situation you are dealing with that requires a conversation? Why would a rational, caring person behave like that? And I know that some people are not rational and some people are not caring, but most of us deal with rational, caring people. And certainly in your personal life, because I know Barb and she knows me, we know each other's heart, we know we care, but we still do things that maybe are not well received, and part of it is our interpretation of why someone would act that way. So what do you want? And so I finally called him and I said, I'd like to meet with you, and we sat in my office, the only one with heat in the room, and it was September through December. Not that that makes a difference, but it was cold in there. But I called him in and I said, I want our relationship to be better than it currently is. Now, I don't know how that would come across to you, but I think that's better. You know, I shared this with a group of people, and one guy said, I said, what would you say if this was going on? He said, well, I'd tell him, you know what, I'm paying you to do this, this is what you're going to do. I thought, well, you could do that. And that's probably what I would have done, well, years ago. So saying, I want our relationship to be better than it currently is. Now, in the workplace, oftentimes, let's suppose you've got a performance issue. Another approach would be to say, if you're sincere, is I want you to be successful on your job. What you're currently doing is not going to result in success. That's a lot better than saying, you know what, you need to get these reports in on time or you're out of here, or whatever it is. But there's a different way of saying it that's respectful and honoring, and it says what you want. You also need to know what don't you want. So what I shared with him, because I could tell he was okay when I said I want a better working relationship because we've got a few months to work together. I said what I don't want, and I gave him some examples. And when I started to say, I said, when you said how many lights do you want in here, and I said, he repeated what he said, and he hung his head and said, I apologize. He knew he was wrong. And my sense is this gentleman was not good at conflict. And he didn't know how to, and I'll give you some more in a minute here. So part of it is how do you convey positive intent? And part of it is to think through and say, what do you want? Usually it's you want a better relationship, you want someone to be more successful, and those are well received because most people are not used to being talked to that way. And then you probably recognize in yourself or in others when the conversation's not going well. And what that looks like is one of you gets defensive. So do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what defensive sounds like or looks like? Usually that happens for two reasons. One reason is we've either discounted the person by kind of not paying attention to what they said or talking over them. The other one is when we discount their idea. If you're in a meeting and somebody says, I think we ought to do this, and you go on as, you know, then when he gets or she gets through talking, someone else talks, it's like, did anyone hear me? And so when people feel discounted or their ideas are devalued, they don't feel safe. And we can recognize that in ourselves and to be able to consciously say, what's going on here that I'm not comfortable or I know I'm getting defensive. And if you're leading the conversation and understand that, then you might step back and say, you know, this doesn't seem to be going well. It's a little uncomfortable. And then again, reiterate what it is that you want out of it. And then what I did with him is I also say, what is it that you want from me? I've never had a contractor before. And so I didn't know what was right or wrong. And he finally explained to me that we were doing some of the work that he normally does. Like we went out and picked out granite from a company and got the fabricator. I didn't know he does that. You know, we went out and did the hardwood floors. We picked them out and got somebody to put them in. And he said to me, well, I had promised to some of my subcontractors that they would do the granite, that they would do the wood floors. And I didn't know, but if he'd have told me up front, but I think because of his wanting harmony, he didn't do it. And I apologized. And I said, from now on, we won't do anything without checking with you. So usually there's two sides to it. So one is to find out, to let them know what you want, what you don't want. The other is to have them tell you what they want. So it ended really well. By the way, one of our subcontractors that he was rude to, after we had this conversation, I actually had to have kind of a refresher on it a couple weeks later because something came up and I said, you know, it's happening again. Oh, by the way, this is another good point. If you're dealing with someone, now not in your personal life because this will get you in trouble, but in the workplace, let's suppose you have a performance issue and you have this conversation and they understand it and say they'll do better. One thing I like to do is say, do I have your permission to call you on it when it happens again, if it happens again? Because sometimes we don't know we're doing it. And I actually did it Well, I've done that a few times. But it's very helpful because they give you permission, and then when it happens, you say it, because we have to break old habits. And when they say it, when it's happening, it's like, okay, this is when I'm doing it. And sometimes they know why. One person I dealt with, when this person was under a lot of pressure, too much on their plate, they reacted differently than when they weren't. So when they didn't understand why the difference. When I called them on it, they said, well, no wonder, this is what's going on. So just understanding how people deal under pressure, and they deal differently than when they're not under pressure. So let's see, we have, here's what I'd like you to do. We've got a few minutes to have you actually think about a situation. It could be from the front, it could be your own personal. Kind of look through this and say, what do I want, what don't I want? How will I convey positive intent? And then how will this go if I were to do this? Think through it with a situation and maybe share for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So I'll give you about 2-3 minutes on that, and then we'll do some Q&A. Okay, so if I could get everyone's attention again. So was that pretty easy, having a model to follow and not having the person here with you? So, you know, the message is most of us want to do it the right way, and I think when we really think through why would a caring, rational person behave like that, or why would I, as a caring, rational person, behave like this, if we can go back to the story we're telling ourselves, because oftentimes we're interpreting facts, and Robert Cooper in one of his books talks about 90% of the time our interpretation is wrong. 90% of the time is a lot. So you can understand why we have problems. And then to say, what do I want? What don't I want? How can I convey positive intent? What does the other person want from me? Because usually both of us have a responsibility. And then be willing to ask each other to point it out, to hold each other accountable. And it'll change the dynamics. And you may be thinking, well, are you using this in your personal life? And Barbara's here. And I want to say we are not masters of this. We've worked on our marriage for a long time. We still have issues, and we still do things inappropriately or poorly. But the difference is we know when we have done that wrong, and we know how to resolve it, how to do it differently. So I hope this is something you can take back and think through. It works in your personal and professional life. And with that, I'd like to entertain some questions. And I'm going to have a helper here. I'm hard of hearing, so she may translate for me. Al?
Yep, we know, at least the understanding I have, that in initiation or conflict resolution, you always want to do it face-to-face. Would you care to address this about should we be doing this face-to-face as opposed to over the phone or email?
Well, the recommendation...
Can I repeat the question?
Oh, go repeat the question.
Yeah, just to repeat the question. That it sounds like, should you have this conversation face-to-face as opposed to by email or by phone?
Okay, I was excited. I knew the answer, so I wanted to answer right away. It's always preferable to do it face-to-face, but it's not always possible. And I usually tell people, I left a message, so I wanted to do it face-to-face, and I couldn't get a hold of the person, didn't have enough time, because something was going to happen before that time, and I wanted him to know what was going on. And I called and I said, I apologize for I couldn't even talk to him. I had to leave a voicemail. That's even worse. Easier for me, but so then I just said, I'm sorry I can't talk to you personally. Our schedules clash, and I need you to know this before this event. And then he called me back later, and it went well. But another question. Back.
So I've been thinking back to a conversation I had with someone, and I'm still pretty sure it was not rational. And in fact, he was let go by the company because he kept having very strong mood altercations with other employees. So, how can you decide if the person, I mean, I agree mostly they're rational. How can you decide there's no way to salvage this, and what do you do?
So it sounds like the question is, sometimes you're in a conversation and you're not really sure, or you're maybe even convinced the person is not rational. So how do you salvage that conversation?
Okay, well, in all of this, and when we're talking about principles, we can only do our part. And even when you do it right with a rational, caring person, if they don't respond appropriately, that's beyond our control. But if you want to live with a good conscience, or being a person of integrity in how you're handling things, then you do your part, and you have to trust that it's not going to be any worse than it was, and it may not be any better. So I don't know if that. By the way, I need to tell you on the contractor, the issue was he budgeted, and what I finally said to him, this is important, I said, you know what, I absolutely want you to tell us when we're spending more than we're budgeting, and then what I want you to do is just stop there, and then we'll say, thank you, we'll either do it or not do it. And that's what we did. I forgot that. Go ahead, another question back there.
Do you change your approach based on either gender, age, or rank?
Do you change your approach based on gender, age, or rank?
I do. I mean, I'm much more gentle with peers and below than typical conversation with a senior person is, I usually say I have high expectations for people, and this is the old Skip. I have high expectations for people in your position, so I'm going to be real direct because I don't want to be subtle and you miss it. So that's probably not a good way to. So I do. I mean, you can soften the word. On all of it, we ought to soften the words. We ought to think through what do we really want. And if you don't come from a pure motive or a good heart, I wouldn't have that conversation until you can get there.
Skip, you said a key thing about the pure in motivation. My colleague here mentioned it, the line, I want you to be successful. Well, that challenges me to maybe concerned, if not upset, about something a colleague, boss is doing. Is, my gosh, do I really want them to be successful? And I need to, you say more about coming to that place so I can actually have a fruitful rather than confrontation.
So I think the request is we'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on how do you really get to the point of genuinely wanting that other person to be successful. Have I got that right?
Well, I got to be careful how I say this. I don't want to start a crucial conversation. Well, you have to be sincere. I mean, that's all I can say. People know when you're not sincere. And worst case is, even if you don't like the person, I'm looking for performance in the workplace. I'm not doing that at home, by the way. So in the workplace, I'm looking for performance. So I've said to people, I'm not looking to make a friend, but we need to get a job done. And I want you to be successful because my success may depend on yours. So there's maybe a personal motive. But I say what I'm thinking. And I usually say, if it's really difficult, I say, I'm not comfortable with this. You're not doing it. Now, if they're not doing the job you need to get rid of them, then you have not, whoever's doing that has not been courageous up front saying, here's the first occurrence, here's the second occurrence. And there's a whole other book on that, Crucial Confrontations. And I'm not going to get into that now, but there's an approach when people aren't fulfilling their responsibility, broken promises, that sort of thing. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question. I think was there a question in the back?
Yeah, we were talking about a couple of different situations where the person just bottling up things, but maybe there's small instances, and then all of a sudden something happens and it's this huge explosion. So if you're a person that tends to bottle things up, should you be having a conversation every time something happens, or how do you regulate yourself, I guess?
Okay, so the question is, some of us have a tendency to bottle things up, and then they build and they build and they build, and then there's an explosion. So I think the question is, should we be having, if we have that tendency, should we be having more of these difficult conversations sooner? Is that?
Okay, so there's actually a principle that says keeping short account. So I think when there's an issue that really bothers us and it bothers the relationship, a good place to start is, why would a caring, rational person behave that way? I believe a lot of it is because we tell ourselves a story that 90% of the time is wrong. We need to check that out. For example, if a male and a female are talking, facing each other, in our Western culture, for two men to face each other and talk is confrontational. For two women, it's relational. So when you got a male and a female, the guy will often look away or look down or actually move off center. And what's the woman thinking? He's not listening. And if you think he's not listening, rather than think that and act as if that's true, you might say, I have a sense when I'm talking to you and you're not looking that you're not listening. He may say, what? But the point is to check out your story and go back to the fact. What are the facts? And that's the thing I've used most often since I've learned this. I haven't told Barb this is what I want, this is what I don't want, but I think, why would a caring, rational person, and that's what Barb is, do this? And it's not to cause me pain, it's my interpretation. So that's it. Well, thank you.